Let's talk about selecting your method. You have a certain research question. Now, how are you going to decide what method you will use to answer your question? So for instance, let's look at this very fundamental question. Imagine you're a researcher, or imagine you have to write a master's thesis. And this is the question that you have. How do we as humans understand spoken language? Very fundamental question. So we're talking to each other, right, each day. This seems very trivial, that we can talk to each other, that we understand each other, but how actually do we understand each other? How do we manage to understand the spoken words that someone says to us? Seems very trivial because typically we understand someone when that person is talking to us, but how does this work? What are the cognitive processes? What are sort of the mental operations that sort of take place when we're listening to someone that allow us to understand someone when that person talks to us? How do we understand spoken language? If you have this question and you want to look for an answer and you find out perhaps that in the literature, the answer is not completely clear yet to this question, you need to select a method. You will find a method that sort of allows you best answer this question. One option could be to simply observe people. So you go out into the world, observe people in their natural behavior, and then perhaps indirectly try to formulate an answer to your question. And those situations are very rich, right? There are all sorts of things going on. There's a lot of noise going on, but people are talking to each other in the way they typically do. Maybe you videotape this and then afterwards you analyze this, and perhaps this will allow you to partially find an answer to your question. How do people understand spoken language? What kind of processes are going on when people understand spoken language, when they listen to someone? On the other hand, if you use a method like this for a question like this, perhaps it's not the best method because it doesn't really allow you to look into the specific mental processes, the specific cognitive operations that are going on when people are talking to each other. So perhaps you need to think of an experimental way to answer your question. And in the study of the psychology of language in psycholinguistics, this is what often happens. So people design a certain experiment in the lab, and they place participants in a certain experimental booth, as the one that you see here. So as a participant, you're placed inside this booth in front of a computer screen, as you can see here. And this is sort of what you see. And then you get shown certain stimuli on this computer screen, for instance, in different experimental conditions. And at the same time, the researcher is measuring something. For instance, they're measuring your eye movements. They're looking at where you're looking and sort of derive some information from your eye gaze to get an answer to this question. Or there might be measuring your brain activity while you're listening to someone. And this perhaps, in a somewhat better way, in the case of this question, might give you an answer as a researcher. So for instance, as a researcher, you could present participants with a certain speaker on this computer screen, and the speaker would be speaking. And then you would measure what's going on in people's brains when they're listening to someone. And perhaps this might tell you something about the cognitive processes that take place when we listen to someone, sort of allowing you to start formulating an answer to this question: how do we understand spoken language? So it's a very controlled situation, right? As a researcher, you have a lot of control about what's going to happen. You can compare different experimental conditions, and perhaps this will give you an answer. And those kind of experiments have been done. So then you learn certain answers to this question. For instance, we have learned that if you present participants with a sentence, for instance, you present participants with the sentence, "I took the car for a spin." What probably happens, as we have learned from very nicely controlled experiments, is that once people hear the first sound of this word, spin, they activate many words in their long-term memory. So we all know a lot of words, right? They are stored in our long-term memory. The knowledge of those words is stored in our long-term memory. If we hear the sound S, the S sound here, this as in spin, already at that point, we start activating all sorts of word candidates that might follow. So you might activate soap or spinach or psychologist, because it also starts with an S sound, spin, spit, sun. And then if you continue, if you continue listening to this word, you hear the second sound, so the P sound. So you hear sp, And then you make a selection. So only those words, perhaps spinach, spin, spit, only those will remain active, because the other ones probably won't be the word that will be following. And then as this sort of input comes in, you sort of narrow down onto one final candidate, and then you select that word in your memory. So you hear the word spin, and you more or less know, okay, that is the word that this speaker is sort of at this moment telling me. And then you link this word form to its meaning, such as you manage to understand the meaning of this word. So this is typically a psycholinguistic theory that is built on the basis of those experiments in the lab. And it sort of provides a first answer to this question: how do we understand spoken words when people talk to us? So we select them in our memory based on the input that we get. Right. So in this case, you would say you don't need virtual reality, right? So you have a certain question. There are all sorts of possible methods that you can use. You can observe people, you can experiment in the lab. Perhaps you want to place people in an MRI scanner to see what goes on in their brain. All sorts of different methods. VR is just one option that you can use. Why would you use VR? Well, if you look at this 2D screenshot, you will see that perhaps VR allows you as a researcher to present participants with an environment that's more or less similar to the real world. So watching small videos on a computer screen is not really the same, right, as having a conversation in everyday life, as talking to somebody. So perhaps the theories that we have based on those computer screen paradigms, they might not completely generalize to those rich everyday situations that we hope our theories generalize to. If you use virtual reality, you can create a bit richer environment that resembles more the everyday phenomenon that you're interested in. So the idea is, if you build a theory based on those kind of VR experiments, the chances that your theory generalizes to everyday life is a bit higher, perhaps. So then you can have a virtual agent or an avatar talk to a participant, and at the same time, as you can see here, measure what goes on in participants' brains. And this way you can start formulating an answer to your question. If you also, again, think of a clever manipulation comparing different conditions in your experiment.